The world has become less stable in the past 17 years, with substantial increases in political instability, the number of conflicts, deaths from those conflicts, and of course, violent demonstrations. And this is according to the 18th edition of the Global Peace Index that was released today by the Institute for Economics and Peace. Now, it also found that in the past 65 countries recorded an improvement, while 97 countries actually recorded a deterioration in peacefulness. So to talk to us more about the key findings of the 18th edition of the Global Peace Index, we are joined virtually by Steve Killelea, who's the spokesperson of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Steve, thanks so much for speaking to us. Good to have you with us here on Morning Live. Welcome.
Thank you. Look, it's my pleasure to be here. Actually, this report's one of the more gloomy reports we've put out. So what we're seeing is that there are more conflicts raging now around the world, 56 in fact, which is more than at any stage since the end of the Second World War. Combined with that, what we can see is that the victories, either by rebels or by governments, is decreasing. So if we went back to, let's say, the 1970s, 49% conflicts were settled that way. That's down to 9%. Then we can also see the peace agreements in the 1970s, 23% were achieved, whereas we're down to 4% in the 2010s. And sort of combined with this, we've got the highest level of deterioration and militarisation in the history of the Global Peace Index, which goes back to 2008. So 108 countries increased their militarisation. And we can also see the number of refugees from conflicts climbing. That's up to 110 million worldwide now. And so bringing all this together, we can see that there's an urgent need for the global community to start to look at many of these minor conflicts and solve them before they become major conflicts. And there's just a lack of focus. So looking at it, what we can see is if you went back to 2019, Ethiopia, Gaza and Ukraine were all minor conflicts. But complicating the matter is when we look at the international community, we can see that there are 92 countries now involved in conflicts beyond their borders. That's the most, again, since the inception of the Global Peace Index, which makes it more difficult to solve many of these protracted conflicts.
So, Steve, have you been able to essentially delve into what some of the key reasons might be for the picture that is emerging now? Because you spoke about the end of conflicts, ending conflicts through peace agreements in the 70s, 2010s, etc. And you look at what's happening in the world right now. What do you think is driving this geopolitical instability?
I think there are many, many factors. I think one is sort of we had the US was pretty dominant through the 80s, 90s. We're now seeing the rise of in the early 2000s. We're now seeing the rise of other major actors. We're also seeing a lot of the middle powers now getting more assertive within the regions in which they operate. But we're also seeing in many cases a deterioration of governments, just the functioning of them. So this is particularly true, let's say, in Africa, up in the Sahel, where if you look at the number of terrorist deaths in the Sahel, it's higher than the rest of the world combined at the moment. So also, as we're moving into it, asymmetric warfare is getting easier and cheaper for small groups to now be able to fight against governments and larger organisations. And partly you can see this is why it was so difficult for the US to actually prevail in Afghanistan or Iraq. We saw the surge of the Islamic State through all that as well. And so if we're looking just at drones, for example, what we've found is that by non-state actors in the last year, there was a 1,400% increase in drone attacks. And that's really quite staggering.
And also, of course, for us here in Sub-Saharan Africa, according to the index, Sub-Saharan Africa has experienced the largest deterioration in peacefulness of any region of the 100, at around 134%. How much of these conflicts actually involve countries beyond our own borders or external influences in this instance, Steve?
Well, I think it's varied. You need to look from country to country. Obviously, you've got the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's 158 out of the 163 countries we measure. It's got a number of different actors, particularly up in northeast Kivu involved. If we go over to the Sahel, you find there's groups like Islamic State, or particularly Islamic State of West Africa. You'd also find that Al-Qaeda's operational there. There's been a number of coups, as we all know, there over the last couple of years. So that situation's destable. We've got the replacement of the Wagner Group also operating up there, which is called Africa Corps. So there'd be a couple of examples of where we can see it. It also come down, if you looked at Sudan, you've got multiple countries supporting either side of that conflict. And then I guess if you've looked at the Ukraine also, you've got the multiple countries supporting the Ukraine as well. So that'd be another example as well.
So, one then immediately looks at the role of the United Nations in global peacekeeping. And one has to question the efficacy then of such a body if the world is becoming unstable. There's been a lot of talk about perhaps, some sort of overhaul of the United Nations. And what are your thoughts on this? And what does the index point to in terms of how effective the United Nations is in peacekeeping?
Well, we haven't done a study of the effectiveness of the peacekeeping operations from the UN. However, having said that, certainly I think all observers would say that there'd be a need to overhaul the UN. But again, it comes back to sort of priorities of governments and where they spend their money. So if we looked, let's say, at the amount of money just spent on the military, the amount of money spent on peacekeeping and peace building is 0.6%. So in a lot of the time, really, this will need to be proactive well before a country falls into conflict. So there's various techniques one can use to determine countries which are at risk or have low levels of resilience. There's really a need to be able to work quite often on developmental issues, building government capacity, police capacity, military capacity, well before they fall into conflict. But these things are expensive, and really, in the long run, the international community needs to look at it carefully. So, for example, conflict comes with tremendous costs. If we look at Syria, the economy now is 83% lower than what it was before the conflict. And if we look at the GDP in the Ukraine, it dropped 39% in the first year. So if you're looking at the conflicts raging, let's say, around Africa, in many of the places, if you could solve them, there'd be substantial boosts in the GDP. Therefore, it makes excellent sense to spend more money on trying to build the capacity so countries don't fall into conflict in the first place.
But of course, it remains a complex question, doesn't it, Steve? Because if you look at the United Nations and some of its agencies, if you look at, for example, where the conflicts are taking place and where those countries stand with regard to their GDP and what they owe, for example, to some of the Bretton Woods institutions, just to begin with, regardless of what they owe to other countries. Is it not inevitable that at some point this was going to happen as people become more educated, as they become more aspirational for a better life, and therefore they were always going to push back against what's going on in some of these countries that are really poor and failing dismally? Would you agree with that sort of sentiment?
Yeah, well, I think what we can see, if you look through Africa, there are many countries which are improving dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. You can see the governance in them improving, the facilities are improving, certainly the education. As people get more educated, they get wiser in being able to understand what effective and good government is. So I think all those things are positive for the future. I think one of the issues for Africa is just the size of the increase in population. So if we look at the rest of the world, its population actually last year decreased, whereas Africa, it's expected for the population of Africa to increase by 90% between now and 2050. And so that will put exceptional strains on resources. So there's a need to be able to look at all these things holistically and try and plan for the future.
Indeed. Just a quick one before we go. Which is the most peaceful country in the world?
That's Iceland. And a lot of people would crack a joke and say, well, that's because it's so cold, no one would go outside. And but if you look at the history of the country, they haven't had any conflict there for over 1,000 years. It's about 1000 AD. And the country is so vastly hostile that over time, people have had to pull together to survive. So, for example, you could, up to maybe 30 years ago, you could walk into anyone's house. If they weren't there, put on the kettle and fix yourself a cup of tea because the environment was so hostile. Similarly, what you find is because it's a small population, they never actually had a king or they never actually had an army which enforced rule of law through the island. So they get together in the middle of the island once a year and determine the rules. And then it was up to the communities to go out and police them. So this created a very different culture environment, let's say, from the rest of Europe, or most of the rest of the world, because it just created for the background for a peaceful environment, which is carried through to today.
And how interesting is that? Unfortunately, we're out of time, Steve, so we have to leave it there. But thank you so much for engaging us this morning. Steve Killelea is the spokesperson of the Institute for Economics and Peace, talking to us about the release of the 18th edition of the Global Peace Index and its findings. And you nodding and smiling about Iceland,
Leanne. We were there last year, and it has to be one of the most peaceful nations I've ever been. I never saw any form of law enforcement, and I never saw anybody disobeying the laws. It was just an incredible experience. That's a program on itself. It's a wonderful, wonderful feeling to be there and to just feel free and yet disciplined. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Don't know what they do right, but they seem to do it. Yeah.
Unlike the rest of the world, where we're seeing more instability.
Sure. All right.